The crystal chandelier exploded above Eleanor's head, sending shards of ancient glass raining down like frozen tears. Her arms instinctively wrapped around Luke, pulling his small body against her chest as screams erupted from the wedding guests below. The scent of blood and burning roses filled the ornate hall, and she could feel her son's heart hammering against her ribs in perfect rhythm with her own terror. The vampire wedding had been a mistake from the very beginning. Eleanor pressed her back against the marble pillar, her florist's apron still dusted with pollen from the arrangements she'd delivered just hours ago. The crimson silk gowns of the immortal guests swirled like liquid fire through the chaos, their fangs gleaming under the fractured light of the remaining chandeliers. She had been nothing more than hired help, invisible among these ancient creatures, until the moment everything went wrong. Luke's fingers dug into her shoulder, his 7-year-old voice barely a whisper. "Mama, my arm hurts." The mark on his forearm was glowing now, two perfect circles of silver light that seemed to pulse with each terrified breath he took. Eleanor had noticed the mark appearing weeks ago, dismissing it as some strange birthmark, but now it blazed like a beacon in the darkness of the collapsing hall. A figure moved through the pandemonium with impossible grace, his silver hair catching the light as he approached them. David's steel-gray eyes found hers across the devastation, and something in his ancient gaze made her breath catch. He was no ordinary guest at this cursed celebration. Power radiated from him like heat from a forge, and when he spoke, his voice cut through the chaos with commanding authority. "The boy carries the mark of the Primus." His words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of stunned silence among the nearby vampires. Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet as she realized that every predatory gaze in the hall had suddenly fixed upon her son. Luke whimpered and buried his face against her neck, his small body trembling with instinctive fear. "I don't know what that means," Eleanor whispered, but even as the words left her lips, she understood that her life as she knew it was ending. The glowing circles on Luke's arm pulsed brighter, and she could see the hunger awakening in the eyes of the creatures surrounding them. These weren't wedding guests anymore. They were hunters, and her son was the prey they'd been seeking for centuries. David stepped closer, his movements fluid and predatory despite the gentleness in his expression. "It means he's the key to breaking our curse. Every clan in the city will come for him now." His hand extended toward her, palm up, an offering that felt more like a lifeline than a choice. "I can protect you both, but the price will change everything you are." The sound of shattering glass echoed from the main entrance as more vampires poured into the hall. Eleanor recognized the desperation in their supernatural speed, the centuries of longing that drove them toward her son with single-minded purpose. Luke's mark blazed brighter, responding to their proximity with painful intensity that made him cry out against her shoulder. "What do you want from us?" Eleanor's voice was steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. She had faced impossible odds before, working 3 jobs to keep Luke fed and housed in their tiny apartment above the flower shop. But this was different. This was survival against creatures that existed beyond the natural laws she understood. "Your trust," David replied, his gray eyes never leaving hers, "and your willingness to become something more than human." The offer hung between them like a bridge across an abyss, and Eleanor found herself measuring the weight of her son's life against the unknown transformation that David promised. Around them, the wedding guests had formed a loose circle, their red eyes gleaming with predatory patience. Eleanor could feel their hunger like a physical presence, pressing against her skin with the weight of centuries. Luke's mark continued to pulse, each flash of silver light drawing them closer despite David's commanding presence. "Mama," Luke whispered, his voice muffled against her neck. "The pretty man has kind eyes." Out of the mouths of babes came wisdom that adults often missed, and Eleanor found herself studying David's face with new attention. Beneath the supernatural power and ancient weariness, she saw something that surprised her: loneliness that matched her own. The decision crystallized in her mind with startling clarity. She had spent years protecting Luke from a world that seemed determined to break them both. Now that world had revealed its true face, showing her creatures of myth and nightmare who coveted her son's blood for their own salvation. David's offer might be her only chance to keep Luke safe, even if it meant stepping into darkness she couldn't yet comprehend. "What kind of protection are you offering?" she asked, her voice carrying the strength that had carried her through years of single motherhood. The vampires surrounding them shifted restlessly, sensing the shift in her resolve, but David's presence held them at bay with an authority that spoke of centuries of command. "The kind that makes you family," David answered, and the word hit Eleanor with unexpected force. Family. She had been alone with Luke for so long that the concept of belonging somewhere, to someone, felt almost foreign. "My claim will shield you from the other clans, but the bond must be real. Blood calls to blood, and the ritual will change you in ways you cannot imagine." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, feeling Luke's warm weight against her chest and the pulse of his mysterious mark through the fabric of his shirt. When she opened them again, David was watching her with an expression that spoke of hope, carefully guarded against disappointment. "If I do this," she said quietly, "if I accept your protection, what happens to who I am? What happens to the life we've built?" The flower shop, their tiny apartment, the normal existence she'd fought so hard to maintain for Luke's sake. All of it felt suddenly fragile, like rose petals ready to scatter in the wind. "You become something stronger," David replied, his hand still extended between them. "Strong enough to protect him from what's coming." His eyes flickered to the vampires pressing closer around them, their patience wearing thin as Luke's mark continued to pulse with hypnotic light. "They won't stop, Eleanor. Tonight was just the beginning. Every clan in the city knows about him now." The truth of his words settled over her like a shroud. There would be no going back to their quiet life, no returning to the safety of anonymity. The mark on Luke's arm had made them targets, and David's protection might be the only thing standing between her son and creatures that viewed him as salvation incarnate. Eleanor took David's offered hand, feeling the coolness of his skin against her palm, and the immediate surge of power that flowed between them. The connection was electric, intimate in a way that made her breath catch and her heart race with something beyond fear. "Then we do this," she whispered, and saw something like relief flash across David's ancient features. "For Luke. For all of us." The words felt like a vow, binding and irreversible, and as David's fingers tightened around hers, Eleanor felt the first stirrings of a transformation that would reshape everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the strength required to protect those who mattered most. The flickering flames of the burning roses mirrored the dawning realization in Eleanor's heart. This was not just about survival, but about a destiny far greater and more terrifying than she could have ever imagined, a bond forged in blood and fire. The ritual chamber beneath the ruined wedding hall felt like stepping into the heart of an ancient mountain. Eleanor's hand trembled in David's grasp as he led her down stone steps worn smooth by centuries of passage. Luke pressed close against her side with his marked arm carefully hidden beneath his jacket sleeve. The air grew thicker with each descending step, heavy with the scent of old magic and something else she couldn't name, something that made her skin prickle with awareness. "The transformation will hurt," David said quietly, his voice echoing off the carved walls that depicted scenes of battles between humans and creatures she was only beginning to understand. "But the alternative is watching them tear Luke apart to harvest his blood drop by drop." His gray eyes met hers in the torchlight, and Eleanor saw the weight of terrible knowledge there. "They've done it before. To other children who carried the mark." Luke's grip on her hand tightened, his 7-year-old intuition picking up on the gravity of their situation even without understanding the full scope of the danger. The mark on his arm had been pulsing steadily since they'd left the chaos above, a beacon that every vampire in the city could sense like a heartbeat in the darkness. Eleanor could feel it too now, a strange resonance that seemed to call to something deep in her bones. The chamber opened into a circular room dominated by an altar carved from black stone, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering light. Eleanor's breath caught as she recognized some of the imagery. Roses intertwined with thorns, silver circles that matched the mark on Luke's arm, and creatures that looked like angels if angels had fangs and eyes like burning coals. This wasn't just a ritual space, it was a testament to a war that had been raging for longer than human civilization. The blood bond will make you mine in the eyes of every vampire clan, David explained, moving to the altar with practiced familiarity. They won't dare challenge my claim without risking centuries of carefully maintained alliances. But Eleanor, he turned to face her, his expression grave. Once we do this, there's no undoing it. The magic will change your very DNA, make you something between human and vampire. You'll be stronger, faster, able to heal from injuries that would kill a mortal, but you'll also be bound to me in ways that go beyond marriage or any human understanding of partnership. Eleanor studied his face, searching for deception or hidden agendas, but found only a weariness that spoke of too many years carrying responsibility for the survival of his people. And Luke? Luke will be under my protection as your son and my heir, David said simply. The other clans won't touch him while he's part of my family. He paused, his jaw tightening. But they'll never stop wanting him. The mark of the Primus appears perhaps once every 1,000 years, and his blood can cure our curse, make us able to walk in sunlight again, to exist without the constant hunger that drives us to hunt. The magnitude of what she was agreeing to settled over Eleanor like a heavy cloak. She was trading her humanity not just for protection, but for a chance to give Luke something she'd never been able to provide before, a family that would stand between him and the darkness of the world. The irony wasn't lost on her that this family happened to be made of creatures that most humans would consider monsters. Mama? Luke's voice was small in the vast chamber, his eyes wide as he took in the ancient carvings and the altar that seemed to hum with power. Are we going to be okay? Eleanor knelt beside him, cupping his small face in her hands and seeing her own fear reflected in his innocent gaze. We're going to be different, she said honestly, because she'd never believed in lying to him about the hard truths of life. But we're going to be together, and we're going to be strong enough to face whatever comes next. Luke nodded solemnly, the mark on his arm pulsing with soft silver light that reflected off the tears gathering in his eyes. Will it hurt? Maybe for a little while, Eleanor admitted, glancing at David, who was preparing something at the altar with movements that spoke of centuries of practice. But sometimes we have to go through pain to get to something better on the other side. The ritual itself was unlike anything Eleanor could have imagined. David's blade was ancient, its metal dark with age and ceremony, and when he drew it across his palm, the blood that flowed was darker than human blood, almost black in the torchlight. Eleanor's hand felt steady as she offered her own palm, but her heart was racing with a mixture of terror and anticipation that made her feel dizzy with adrenaline. The moment their blood mixed on the altar's surface, the world exploded into sensation. Power flowed through Eleanor's veins like liquid fire, rewriting her genetic code with each heartbeat, and she could feel David's memories bleeding into her consciousness. Centuries of loneliness, the weight of ruling a clan of creatures caught between life and death, the careful balance of alliances that kept their world from descending into chaos. But beneath all of that, she felt his genuine care for her and Luke, a protective instinct that went beyond political necessity. The transformation was agony and ecstasy combined. Eleanor's bones felt like they were being broken and reformed, her muscles stretching and strengthening, her senses expanding until she could hear Luke's heartbeat from across the chamber and smell the fierce sweat of vampires gathering in the tunnels above. But with the pain came power. Real, tangible strength that she could feel coiling in her muscles like compressed springs. When it was over, Eleanor found herself on her knees beside the altar, her body humming with energy she'd never possessed. David knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as she struggled to process the flood of new sensations. She could see in the darkness now, could hear conversations happening 3 floors above them, could sense the emotional states of everyone within 100 yards. It was overwhelming and intoxicating and terrifying all at once. "How do you feel?" David asked, and Eleanor noticed that his voice sounded different now, richer, more complex, as if she were hearing harmonics that human ears couldn't detect. "Like I could run through walls," she whispered, and was surprised to hear the truth in her own words. She felt like she could take on the world if it meant keeping Luke safe. The protective instincts she'd always carried as his mother had been amplified 100-fold, turned into something fierce enough to challenge gods. Luke was watching them both with fascination rather than fear, his childlike acceptance of the supernatural making the transition easier for all of them. "Mama, your eyes are pretty now," he said, pointing at her face. "They sparkle like David's do." Eleanor looked at David and saw her own wonder reflected in his transformed gaze. Whatever she had become, she was no longer entirely human, but she didn't feel lost or diminished. She felt like she'd finally found the strength she'd been searching for her entire life. The sound of footsteps in the tunnel above made them all freeze. David's expression darkened, his newly enhanced senses obviously picking up more than Eleanor's still adjusting abilities could detect. "Malik," he said grimly, the name carrying weight that made Eleanor's blood run cold even without understanding why. "He's brought others with him. They're not here to negotiate." Eleanor rose to her feet, surprised by the fluid grace of her movements and the way her body seemed to respond to her will with supernatural precision. The fear she should have felt was there, but it was tempered by something new. Confidence born of power and the absolute certainty that she would die before letting anyone harm Luke. "How many?" she asked, and was startled by the calm authority in her own voice. "Too many for a fair fight," David replied, but there was something like pride in his expression as he looked at her. "But then again, we're not planning to fight fair." He moved to a weapons cache hidden behind one of the carved panels, revealing an arsenal that spoke of centuries of preparation for exactly this kind of siege. The first wave of attackers came down the stairs like a black tide, their eyes glowing red in the darkness and their fangs bared in expressions of primal hunger. Eleanor felt her new instincts take over, her body moving with lethal precision as she placed herself between the attackers and Luke. The protective magic of David's claim might shield them from political repercussions, but it wouldn't stop vampires desperate enough to risk everything for a chance at Luke's blood. Eleanor's first kill was almost anticlimactic. The vampire lunged at her with supernatural speed, but her enhanced reflexes made his attack seem sluggish, predictable. Her hand caught him by the throat mid-leap, and she was shocked by her own strength as she crushed his windpipe without conscious effort. The body crumbled to ash in her grasp, leaving only the memory of how easy it had been to take a life in defense of her son. David fought beside her with centuries of experience, his movements economical and brutal as he cut through their attackers with weapons that seemed to sing in his hands. But Elena could see the strain in his expression, the way his jaw tightened with each new wave of enemies that poured into the chamber. They were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers, and even their enhanced abilities couldn't hold out indefinitely against an army. "There are more coming," David said grimly during a brief lull between attacks. "Malik has allied with at least 3 other clans. This isn't just about Luke anymore. They're making a play for control of the city. Eleanor wiped ash from her hands, still amazed by the transformation that had turned her from a struggling florist into something capable of fighting supernatural predators. Then we don't stay here and wait for them, she said decisively. We take Luke and we run. Find somewhere we can make a real stand. David's eyes flashed with something that might have been admiration. The old monastery, he said after a moment. It's warded against vampire intrusion, built on consecrated ground. If we can reach it, we'll have defensible position and time to plan our next move. Luke had been remarkably quiet through the fighting, pressed against the altar with his marked arm glowing steadily in the darkness. But now he spoke up, his voice carrying a wisdom that seemed far beyond his 7 years. They're not just hunting me, he said quietly. They're afraid of what I might become if I grow up. Eleanor felt her heart clench at the understanding in her son's eyes. The innocence of childhood was being stripped away by necessity, replaced by a knowledge that no child should have to carry. But along with that knowledge came something else, a strength that reminded her of David's ancient determination. Then we make sure you get the chance to grow up, she said firmly, kneeling beside Luke and pulling him into her arms. All of us together. The journey to the monastery was a running battle through the city's underground tunnels. Elena discovered that her new abilities extended beyond strength and speed. She could sense the emotional states of their pursuers, could feel their locations like pins on a mental map, could even influence their actions in small ways by projecting confidence or fear. It was intoxicating and frightening to realize how much power the ritual had awakened in her. They lost 2 of David's allies in the tunnels, brave vampires who gave their lives to buy Elena and Luke precious seconds to escape. Each death weighed on Elena's conscience, but she pushed the guilt aside in favor of the fierce protectiveness that had become her driving force. This was war, and in war, survival meant making impossible choices. The monastery rose from the mist-shrouded hills like something out of a Gothic nightmare, its ancient stones blackened by centuries of weather and conflict. But Elena could feel the power in its walls, a protective magic that made her skin tingle with recognition. This was sanctuary, at least for now. The wards will hold against direct assault, David explained as they approached the massive doors. But they won't stop Malik from laying siege. He has time on his side. Vampires can wait for decades if necessary. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of truth that came from the new instincts the ritual had awakened. Then we don't wait, she said firmly. We end this before it becomes a siege. David turned to her with surprise and something that looked like hope. What do you mean? I mean we turn the tables, Elena said, her mind racing with possibilities she couldn't have conceived of as a mere human. You said Luke's blood can cure the vampire curse. What if we offered that cure, but on our terms? What if we made them choose between war and redemption? The idea was audacious, dangerous, and possibly suicidal. But as Elena looked at her son's glowing mark and felt the power thrumming through her transformed body, she knew it was also their only real chance at building a future that didn't involve running from shadows for the rest of their lives. David's expression was unreadable in the moonlight. You're talking about changing the fundamental nature of vampire society, he said slowly. About offering them something they've dreamed of for centuries, but only if they accept you and Luke as equals rather than prey. I'm talking about survival, Elena corrected, and about building something better for Luke to inherit than an endless war. She looked up at the monastery's towers, their crosses stark against the cloudy sky. We make our stand here, but not just with weapons. We make it with hope. Luke's mark pulsed brighter, as if responding to her words, and Elena felt the truth of her decision settle into her bones with the weight of destiny. They were no longer running from their fate. They were running toward it, ready to reshape the world if that's what it took to build a safe place for their strange new family to flourish. As the dawn broke over the shattered walls, bringing both painful light and unexpected reprieve, Elena and David stood amidst the ruins, their hands intertwined, knowing the immediate battle was won, but the true war, and their shared future, had only just begun. The monastery's ancient bells tolled midnight as Malik's army surrounded the consecrated walls like a plague of shadows. Elena stood at the highest tower window, her enhanced vision cutting through the darkness to count the glowing eyes that dotted the hillside below. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Every vampire clan in the region had answered Malik's call, drawn by the promise of Luke's miraculous blood and the chance to break the curse that had bound their kind for millennia. "He's brought more than I expected," David said quietly from beside her, his steel-gray eyes reflecting the moonlight as he surveyed their enemies. 3 major clans at least. Some I don't even recognize. His jaw tightened with the weight of centuries of political maneuvering now rendered useless by desperation and greed. Elena felt the power thrumming through her transformed body, stronger now after days of practice with her new abilities. She could sense the emotional state of every vampire gathered below, their hunger, their hope, their willingness to die for a chance at redemption. But beneath all of that, she felt something else. Fear. They were afraid of what Luke represented, afraid of change, afraid that salvation might come with a price they weren't prepared to pay. "Where's Luke?" she asked, though she could already sense his presence in the monastery's protected chambers below. "Safe in the warded room with the old texts," David replied. "The mark has been growing brighter since sunset. I think it's responding to their proximity." Elena nodded, her enhanced hearing picking up the sound of Luke's heartbeat 3 floors below, steady and strong despite the terror surrounding them. Her son had shown remarkable courage throughout their ordeal, adapting to their supernatural reality with the resilience that only children possessed. But she knew this night would test all of them beyond their limits. A voice boomed across the courtyard, amplified by supernatural power until it seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient building. "David of the Silver Throne," Malik called, his words dripping with centuries of accumulated hatred. "Send out the boy and the woman, and we'll grant you a clean death. Refuse, and we'll tear this place apart stone by stone until we find them." David's response was to step into full view at the window, his presence radiating the authority that had kept his clan intact through decades of political upheaval. "The boy is under my protection," he called back, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "Any who would harm him must first face me." Elena heard the rustle of movement below as hundreds of vampires shifted restlessly, their patience worn thin by days of pursuit and the tantalizing proximity of their salvation. She could feel their hunger like a physical weight pressing against the monastery's protective wards. "Then face us you shall," Malik replied, and Elena saw him step into the moonlight at the base of the hill. Even at this distance, his presence was unmistakable. Ancient power wrapped around a core of burning ambition that had festered for centuries. "But know that your death will only delay the inevitable. The boy's blood will be ours, whether you live to see it or not." Elena felt something crystallize in her chest, a certainty that came from the protective instincts the transformation had amplified beyond human comprehension. She would not let her son become a commodity to be harvested by creatures too afraid to face their own mortality. If they wanted Luke, they would have to go through her first. "David," she said quietly, her voice carrying a steel that surprised even her. "How long until dawn?" "6 hours," he replied, glancing at her with curiosity and growing respect. "Why?" "Because I have an idea," Elena said, moving away from the window toward the ancient weapon cache David had shown her earlier. "But it's going to require us to do something that goes against every survival instinct we have." She selected a blade from the collection, its weight perfect in her transformed hands. We're going to walk out there and face them. David's expression shifted from curiosity to alarm. Elena, there are hundreds of them, even with your new abilities. We're not going out there to fight them all, Elena interrupted, her mind racing with the details of a plan so audacious it bordered on madness. We're going to offer them what they want, but on our terms. She turned to face him, seeing her own determination reflected in his ancient eyes. Luke's blood can cure the curse, right? What if we offered that cure to anyone willing to swear loyalty to our family? What if we turned their desperation into allegiance? David stared at her for a long moment, his enhanced mind processing the implications of her proposal. You're talking about fundamentally changing vampire society, he said slowly. About creating a new power structure with Luke at the center. I'm talking about survival, Elena corrected, checking the edge of her blade with movements that felt natural despite her recent transformation. And about building something better than endless war. She moved toward the stairs that would take her to Luke. But first, we need to make them understand that Luke isn't just a resource to be exploited. He's the future of their entire species. They found Luke in the warded chamber, sitting cross-legged on the floor with ancient texts spread around him like fallen leaves. The mark on his arm was blazing with silver light now, pulsing in rhythm with something Elena couldn't identify. As they entered, he looked up with eyes that seemed far older than his 7 years. They're really scared, aren't they? He said quietly, his child's intuition cutting straight to the heart of the matter. All those vampires outside, they're not just hungry. They're afraid they'll never be free. Elena knelt beside him, marveling at the wisdom that seemed to flow from her son like water from a spring. They've been cursed for so long that they've forgotten what it means to hope, she explained, smoothing his dark hair with gentle fingers. Your blood can change that, but only if they're willing to accept that you're not just a cure to be consumed. You're a person who deserves to choose his own destiny. Luke nodded solemnly, the mark on his arm pulsing brighter as he spoke. And what if they won't listen? What if they just want to take my blood anyway? Elena felt the fierce protectiveness that had become her defining characteristic surge through her veins like liquid fire. Then we show them that some things are worth fighting for, she said simply, no matter the cost. The walk across the monastery's courtyard felt like stepping into a dream painted in shades of silver and shadow. Elena held Luke's hand on one side while David flanked them on the other, their small family presenting a united front against the army of immortal predators that waited beyond the consecrated walls. The protective wards hummed with power around them, but Elena knew that once they stepped outside the monastery's boundaries, they would be truly on their own. Malik was waiting for them at the edge of the consecrated ground, his ancient features twisted with hunger and hatred that had been fermenting for centuries. Behind him, hundreds of vampires pressed forward like a tide of living darkness, their red eyes fixed on Luke with an intensity that made Elena's new instincts scream warnings. So, Malik said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. The little family decides to face their fate with dignity. How refreshingly human of you. His gaze fixed on Elena with calculating interest. Though I understand you're not entirely human anymore, are you, dear Elena? David's ritual has made you something new. Something unprecedented. Elena stepped forward, feeling the power that flowed through her transformed body like electricity through copper wire. Something strong enough to protect my son, she said clearly, her voice carrying to every vampire gathered on the hillside, and something that understands the difference between salvation and slaughter. A murmur ran through the assembled clans at her words, and Elena saw uncertainty flicker across faces that had been set in expressions of predatory certainty. She pressed her advantage, raising her voice so that all could hear. You've come here seeking Luke's blood because you believe it can cure your curse, she called out, her enhanced voice carrying easily across the distance. But what you're really seeking is freedom from the hunger that drives you to hunt, from the weakness that forces you to hide from the sun. Luke can give you that freedom, but not if you treat him like cattle to be bled dry. Malik's expression darkened with fury. Pretty words, he snarled. But we both know the boy's blood is our only hope. Whether he gives it willingly or we take it by force, the result will be the same. Will it? Eleanor challenged, feeling Luke's small hand tighten in her grip and drawing strength from his trust in her. Because I think you're wrong about that. I think the cure requires more than just blood. I think it requires acceptance, understanding, and a willingness to change, not just your bodies, but your hearts. She stepped forward again, moving beyond the monastery's protective boundary and feeling the ward's protection slip away like a discarded cloak. The vampires pressed closer, their hunger palpable in the night air, but something in Elena's bearing made them hesitate. This was not the terrified human mother they had expected to face. This was something new, something that radiated power and authority despite her recent transformation. Luke is my son, Elena continued, her voice carrying the absolute certainty that had carried her through years of single motherhood and now through this supernatural nightmare. But he's also the key to your salvation. The question is, do you want a future where that salvation comes through violence and exploitation? Or do you want one where it's freely given by someone who chooses to help you? Luke stepped forward beside her, his marked arm blazing with silver light that seemed to push back the darkness surrounding them. I'm not afraid of you, he said, his 7-year-old voice carrying a clarity that made several vampires actually step backward. But I'm sad for you. You've been hungry for so long that you've forgotten how to be anything else. Malik's composure cracked for the first time, his ancient features twisting with rage and something that might have been pain. Enough! He roared, his form blurring with supernatural speed as he lunged toward Luke, with fangs bared and claws extended. Elena's response was instantaneous and devastating. The protective instincts that had been amplified by her transformation exploded into action, her enhanced reflexes making Malik's attack seem clumsy and predictable. She intercepted him mid-leap, her hand closing around his throat with crushing force that made his eyes bulge with shock and pain. You want to test my resolve? Elena snarled, her voice carrying harmonics that made the assembled vampires take another step backward. You want to see how far I'll go to protect my son? She lifted Malik off his feet with one hand, her strength showcasing the full extent of her transformation. Then learn this. I am no longer just a mother fighting for her child. I am something new, something that bridges the gap between human and vampire. And I will burn this entire world down before I let anyone harm him. Malik clawed at her grip, his supernatural strength useless against the power that coursed through Elena's transformed body. Behind him, his army shifted restlessly, uncertainty replacing the predatory confidence they had carried into battle. This was not what they had expected. Elena was not what they had expected. But I'm also something else, Elena continued, her voice carrying a gentleness that seemed impossible given the violence of her actions. I'm someone who understands that survival sometimes means choosing cooperation over conquest. She released Malik, letting him collapse to the ground at her feet. Luke's blood can cure your curse, but only if it's given freely. Only if you accept him as family rather than prey. David stepped forward, his ancient authority combining with Elena's newfound power to create a presence that dominated the entire gathering. Elena speaks truth, he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of leadership. The mark of the Primus is not just a source of power, it's a symbol of unity between human and vampire. Luke represents a future where our species can coexist rather than constantly struggle for dominance. Elena felt the shift in the crowd's emotional state, the way hunger and desperation began to give way to something that might have been hope. But she also sensed the resistance from Malik and his most loyal followers, vampires too set in their ways to accept change, even if it meant salvation. Choose, Elena said simply, her enhanced senses tracking the emotional currents that flowed through the assembled clans. Accept Luke as part of our family. Swear loyalty to the future we're building together, and receive the cure you've sought for centuries. Or maintain your old ways and face the consequences of threatening my son. The battle that followed was swift and brutal. Malik's hardcore supporters threw themselves at Elena with desperate fury, but they were fighting against something they had never encountered before. A mother's love amplified by supernatural power and given form through David's ancient magic. Elena moved through their ranks like a force of nature, her blade singing through the air as she cut down anyone who posed a threat to Luke. The monastery's walls crumbled around them as the fighting intensified, ancient stones no match for the supernatural forces being unleashed. But as the dawn began to break over the hills, casting painful light across the battlefield, Elena found herself standing triumphant amidst the ashes of those who had refused to bend. Malik lay at her feet, his ancient body finally still after centuries of causing suffering. The surviving vampires knelt in the growing light, their submission complete, and their allegiance sworn to the strange new family that had reshaped their world in a single night. Elena felt their loyalty settle into her bones like warm honey, binding them all together in ways that went beyond politics or fear. Luke stepped forward, his marked arms still glowing with silver light, and placed his small hand in Elena's transformed one. "Is it over, Mama?" he asked, his voice carrying exhaustion and hope in equal measure. Elena looked around at the kneeling vampires, at David, whose ancient loneliness was finally beginning to heal, at the ruins of the monastery where they had made their stand against impossible odds. "The fighting is over," she said gently, pulling Luke close and feeling David's strong presence beside them both. "But our new life is just beginning." As the sun rose fully over the hills, David's skin began to smoke and burn in the morning light. But Luke stepped forward without fear, his glowing mark pulsing with power as he reached up to touch David's face. The moment their skin made contact, the burning stopped, and for the first time in centuries, David stood unharmed in the light of day. "The cure," Elena whispered, understanding flooding through her as she watched her son casually perform miracles that vampires had dreamed of for millennia. "It's not just his blood, it's his touch, his acceptance, his willingness to heal." One by one, the kneeling vampires approached Luke, receiving his blessing and feeling the curse that had defined their existence melt away like snow in sunlight. Elena watched with wonder and pride as her 7-year-old son became the instrument of their salvation, not through violence or exploitation, but through the simple act of choosing to help. David took Elena's hand as they watched Luke transform their former enemies into something new. Vampires who could walk in sunlight, who no longer felt the constant hunger that had driven them to hunt, who had been given a second chance at existence through the grace of a child who had chosen forgiveness over fear. "I love you," Elena said quietly, the words carrying the weight of complete truth and absolute commitment. "Not because of the ritual or the bond or the protection you've given us, but because you saw Luke's value as a person before you ever considered his usefulness as a cure. Because you offered us family when we had nothing but each other." David's ancient eyes filled with something that might have been tears as he pulled her close, their transformed bodies fitting together with perfect symmetry. "And I love you for your courage," he replied, his voice rough with centuries of suppressed emotion. "For choosing to become something new rather than accepting defeat. For teaching me that strength isn't just about power, it's about knowing what's worth protecting." Luke looked up from his work of healing their former enemies, his young face bright with joy at seeing his mother and David together. "Are we really going to be a family now?" he asked, his mark pulsing with gentle silver light that seemed to bless everything it touched. Elena knelt beside her son, pulling him into her arms and feeling David's protective presence surrounding them both like armor made of love and determination. Around them, the transformed vampires were discovering what it meant to exist, without the curse that had defined them for so long, their faces bright with wonder as they experienced true freedom for the first time in centuries. "We already are a family," Elena said softly, her voice carrying the certainty that had carried her through impossible odds and brought them all to this moment of triumph. "And we're going to build something beautiful together. Something that honors both what we were and what we've chosen to become." As the morning sun bathed them all in warm, healing light, Elena felt the last of her doubts melt away. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious not through violence alone, but through the radical act of choosing love over fear, unity over division, hope over despair. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. A family forged in blood and shadow, but tempered by light and the endless possibilities that came with choosing to build rather than destroy. The mark on Luke's arm pulsed one final time before fading to a gentle silver glow, its work complete. He had become the bridge between two worlds, the key that unlocked a future where vampires and humans could coexist, and the heart of a family that had redefined what it meant to be strong. Elena held her son close and felt David's arms encircle them both. Their strange and wonderful family finally complete and ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring.